Hi, welcome to my channel, where every story hits different. Hit subscribe, and let's dive in. My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 29, and I work as an MRI technologist in Nashville, which means my days are built around other people's emergencies, quiet panic, and the kind of pressure that teaches you how to stay calm while your world is shaking. That skill came in handy the afternoon my father decided to erase me from his house like I had never lived there. I was halfway through a 5-mile run, sweat freezing at the back of my neck in the December wind, when my phone buzzed 3 times in a row. The first message was from my father. "We sold your bed, desk, and everything in your room for $750. Your cousin needs it for her baby. Want to come home for Christmas? Buy us a new living room set, $3,200 cash. Otherwise, stay away. We already changed the locks and gave your key to her." Before I could even process that, my mother added that they had already told people at church I abandoned them for a rich boyfriend and that the whole congregation thought I was ungrateful trash. Then my sister chimed in like it was all some family joke and said the neighbors already thought I was on drugs and asked if she should confirm it. I stood there on the sidewalk with my lungs burning and realized this was not one cruel impulse. It was coordinated. They had not only sold my things, they had built a story where I was the villain and expected me to pay admission to re-enter the house they had locked me out of. So instead of driving there, I turned toward the one place in town where truth still had paperwork behind it. The drive to my grandmother Eleanor Brooks's house took 40 minutes, and by the time I reached her porch, I knew this was not a family misunderstanding. It was extortion wrapped in Christmas paper. Eleanor read every message slowly, asked one question that changed everything, and laid a blue folder of ownership documents across her coffee table. Then she told me to call my best friend Jessa Nolan, because I was not facing what came next alone. At Eleanor's kitchen table, Jessa arrived with Thai takeout, a legal pad, and the expression of a woman who had been waiting years for my family to meet evidence. We built a timeline, backed up screenshots, and listed everything taken from my room. My bed frame, my study desk, my grandmother's quilt, my late grandfather's letters, and the engraved watch Eleanor left to me after I passed my MRI boards. That was the point where my throat tightened. Because the room was never just furniture. It was proof that I existed in that house as a daughter, not as a spare resource they could liquidate when someone else needed comfort. Jessa said the reason they thought I would pay was not because the demand made sense. It was because they had trained me to confuse guilt with duty. Minutes later, my father, Dennis Brooks, called. He opened with fear dressed as accusation and demanded to know what I had told Eleanor. I told him the truth. He tried the usual script about family helping family, about Kayla needing space, about me making everything sound uglier than it was. I answered point by point. He sold my property, changed locks on a house he did not own, gave my key to someone else, demanded money to let me come home for Christmas, and threatened to lie about abuse if I refused. Then my mother Cheryl cut in nervously from the background and my sister Brianna made some smug comment about whether I wanted the watch back. That was when Eleanor took the phone from my hand. In a voice so calm it sounded final, she told Dennis he had 30 days to vacate her property, that no one in that house would sell or move one more thing belonging to me, and that if my watch could not be recovered, he could explain himself to an attorney. The panic in his voice after that told me more than any apology ever could. He called it a joke. He called it family banter. Eleanor said, "Natalie knows exactly how you talk. That is why you are begging." Then she hung up. My hands shook under the table, not because I regretted telling the truth, but because some old reflex in me still expected punishment for exposing what everyone else called private. My mother left voicemails. Brianna texted new threats. Eleanor only slid the folder closer and told me the line I needed to hear. "You did not cause this by telling the truth. People blame the messenger when the message exposes the theft." For the first time in years, I was not alone in the room, acting like reality mattered. The next morning I went back to my parents' house with Eleanor, Jessa, printed screenshots, and enough calm to make every lie in that place sound small. Cheryl opened the door before we knocked. Dennis stood behind her, trying to look offended instead of exposed. Kayla sat on the couch with both hands over her stomach, and Brianna leaned against the wall with the expression she always wore when she thought cruelty counted as confidence. Eleanor walked in and told everyone to sit down, and somehow they did. Dennis started talking about misunderstandings, temporary room changes, family sacrifice, and the baby. Eleanor ignored all of it and told me to read the messages aloud. So I did. The demand for a new living room set, the stay away for Christmas line, the church gossip, the threat to say, I hit my mother, Brianna's message about drugs. Read in order, their words sounded exactly like extortion. Dennis tried to interrupt, but Eleanor shut him down with one raised finger. Cheryl tried crying. Brianna tried mocking Kayla for looking nervous. Then I asked my mother directly whether she told church members I hit her. She claimed I grabbed her arm during an argument last Christmas. I reminded her she tripped over a nativity box in the garage and blamed me because I left dinner early. That silence afterward told me the truth had finally entered the room with enough witnesses to stay there. Dennis stood up and called me selfish. Said everything was always about my room, my job, my schedule, my stress. I stood too and told him families do not sell a daughter's inheritance, lock her out, charge admission to come home, and weaponize church gossip because they want furniture. Eleanor placed the formal notice on the coffee table and told them they would provide a written inventory of every item sold, moved, or damaged. If the watch did not come back, Dennis could explain to a judge why he sold property specifically left to me. That was the first moment I saw real fear on his face. By evening, the story they built about me was already collapsing through church circles and neighborhood calls. Once Eleanor told 2 people the truth, those 2 told 2 more. Suddenly, the narrative was not poor parents abandoned by an ungrateful daughter. It was grown. Adults sold their daughters things, lied about abuse, and got eviction papers from the legal owner of the house. Dennis called me 12 times. Cheryl sent paragraphs beginning with, I am sorry you are upset. Brianna texted that I ruined Christmas. I replied that I ruined her leverage and blocked her for the night. Later, sitting in Eleanor's guest room, I made one practical list and one painful one. The practical list covered pawn shops, neighbors, mail, copies of documents, and every threat. The painful list covered years of being volunteered, shamed, and treated like the emergency reserve every time someone else wanted comfort. Once I wrote the pattern down, it stopped looking like bad luck and started looking like policy. That night, Kayla called me crying for real, not in the soft, manipulative way she usually used when she wanted space made for her. She said she never asked for my watch, and Dennis had told her my room was basically abandoned and already offered to her. I told her I believed about half of that, and she did not argue. Then she admitted the piece that made everything click. Dennis promised her my room in November because he owed her money and needed to keep her close instead of losing control to her boyfriend's family. Suddenly, the whole living room demand made sense. My father was not supporting family. He was moving debt, guilt, and bodies around like furniture, and I had become one more asset to liquidate. Eleanor was not surprised. She said he had done versions of this for years, just never to someone prepared to answer back. That phrase stayed with me because it named the difference between the girl I used to be and the woman I had become. I did not confuse endurance with virtue anymore. I did not think protecting family secrets made me loyal. Near midnight, Dennis left a voicemail begging me to explain to Eleanor that the whole thing had been misunderstood. I did not call back. 2 days later, a neighbor sent me security footage from his garage camera. It showed Dennis and Brianna loading my furniture into a trailer while Cheryl stood in the yard holding my grandmother's quilt. On the recording, my father laughed and said, "Sell the nice stuff first. Natalie will not fight. She never does." I watched that clip 3 times because one sentence managed to explain my entire childhood. He counted on my silence like other people count on direct deposit. I saved copies everywhere, then sent the clip to Dennis with a single line. "This is why you are not getting an explanation. You are getting consequences." He called within seconds. Then Cheryl called. Then Brianna. Then one of Cheryl's sisters, who only ever contacted me when somebody needed their bad behavior translated into family values. While that was happening, a pawn shop owner in the next county recognized the watch from the photos and initials I sent around. Dennis had sold it under his own driver's license. That mattered legally, morally, and symbolically. Jessa covered the hold fee before I could stop her, called it an investment in justice, and when I finally held the watch again, I cried harder than I had over the bed, the desk, or the lock change. Eleanor had given it to me after I passed my boards and said, "Time does not heal everything, but it reveals people." She was right. It revealed Dennis as a man who mistook access for authority, Cheryl as someone who called manipulation motherhood, and Brianna as a woman who treated cruelty like charm. It also revealed me more clearly than I expected. I was not weak because I survived quietly. I was dangerous to them the minute I stopped surviving on their terms. 3 evenings later, Dennis came to Eleanor's porch to beg in person. I knew he was outside before I saw him because the old wind chime moved harder than the breeze justified, and my body always recognized him before my ears did. Eleanor stepped out with me. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not humble, just reduced. He asked me to explain to Eleanor that everything got out of hand, to tell church people Cheryl panicked, to let them stay until spring, to help him fix this before it became permanent. He promised he would get my things back, smooth the story over, do whatever it took. There it was. Not remorse. Fear. He was not grieving what they did to me. He was terrified the system finally turned on him. I told him the explanation was simple. He thought I needed his house more than I needed my self-respect. He thought I would pay to be let back into a family that had already sold me in pieces. He thought being my father meant I would always absorb the damage so he could avoid it. He was wrong. He tried to cry then, but I had spent too many years comforting the person who caused the wound. Eleanor stepped forward and told him to leave her property immediately, or she would call the police. He backed down the steps of a house he had never owned and drove away without the final speech he probably imagined. Christmas that year was quiet. I spent it at Eleanor's table with Jessa, casseroles, pecan pie, and absolutely no requirement to earn my seat. That should have felt like the ending, but the real work started after the dramatic moment was over. In January, I went back to full hospital hours and noticed how peaceful ordinary life felt when I was not bracing for the next family crisis manufactured out of someone else's irresponsibility. I changed my mailing address, updated every account, and stopped treating my parents' chaos like weather I had to organize my life around. Brianna tried sending messages through cousins and church people saying I was making everything bigger than it needed to be. I did not answer. Cheryl mailed me a card with a Bible verse, no apology, and a line about mothers making mistakes. I filed it with the evidence. Dennis sent a text asking if we could speak privately, father to daughter. That phrase used to weaken me. Now it sounded like another locked room. I answered with one sentence. If it cannot be said in writing, it does not need to be said to me. That became my rule for the rest of the winter, and the moment I stopped leaving doors open for manipulation, their options got smaller fast. By February, the church gossip had fully turned. People no longer approached Cheryl with automatic sympathy. They approached her with the careful politeness reserved for someone whose story cannot survive direct questions. One Sunday, I went to church with Eleanor because I refused to hand them public space too. The room grew subtly quieter when we walked in. Cheryl stared straight ahead. Dennis did not show up at all. Brianna sat 2 rows back looking injured for an audience that had finally gotten tired of the show. I expected humiliation. Instead, I felt steady. After the service, women who had once repeated half of Cheryl's story quietly apologized. One admitted Cheryl had called, claiming I was unstable from hospital stress. Another said Dennis asked whether the church could help replace furniture because his daughter abandoned them. They sounded embarrassed now, not for me, but forever, almost believing it. Meanwhile, Dennis had to explain the pawn record, the lock change, and the messages. It turns out explaining is much harder when volume no longer counts as evidence. Even with all of that, grief still arrives sideways. One night in a store aisle, buying simple things for my apartment, I started crying over hangers because replacing ordinary objects can hurt more than surviving dramatic scenes. Jessa found me and said, Grief is what happens when clarity kills the fantasy you kept alive for too long. She was right. I was not mourning the family I had. I was mourning the family I kept editing them into every holiday. Work helped. In the imaging department, facts stayed boring in the best possible way. A scan either showed what it showed or it did not. Machines did not care who cried louder. One evening after a long shift, I sat with the recovered watch in my hand and realized the deepest injury was not the furniture. It was that they expected me to accept humiliation as the price of belonging. Eleanor said something then that I wrote down and kept for months. Love that requires your silence is not love. It is a management style. Around the same time, Kayla sent a short message saying she moved in with her boyfriend's parents and was sorry for believing what was convenient. It was not a complete apology, but it was at least honest enough to stand on. For that family, honesty in any amount felt almost revolutionary. March brought the moving trucks. Eleanor stood in the driveway with a clipboard, coffee, and the kind of composure that made contractors suddenly remember their manners. Dennis avoided my eyes. Cheryl moved around with red eyes and theatrical silence. Brianna complained about boxes and unfairness, which was interesting from someone who laughed while helping uproot me. I was there only to confirm what belonged to me and what did not. The attorney wanted every exchange visible and documented, so that is what I gave him. No whispered side talks, no emotional detours, no revised history, just inventory, signatures, and handoffs. The house looked different, stripped of the performance that used to fill it. Smaller, less impressive, more obviously borrowed. When I stood in the doorway of my old room, I could almost see every younger version of myself that had tried to earn softness there. The exhausted college student. The daughter coming home after a 12-hour shift hoping this holiday would be easier. The woman who still believed that if she stayed useful enough, the emotional invoice would stop arriving. Dennis tried one last time around noon, asking whether I really thought this was how families should end. I told him families end long before paperwork when respect gets replaced by leverage. That was the last full sentence I gave him in person. Outside, neighbors who once heard half-made rumors now greeted me with straightforward kindness. One older woman said she was glad I stood up for myself because she had watched too many women in our county get blamed for refusing to be used. Dennis's final defeat was not just legal, it was social. Bullies depend on private systems where everybody feels too awkward to say the obvious thing out loud. Once the obvious thing gets said, their size shrinks. After the trucks left, I walked through the empty living room with Eleanor. Light from the kitchen window stretched across the floor, and the place smelled like dust and the end of a long argument. She asked if I wanted anything else from the house before she sold it. I surprised both of us by saying no. Closure, it turned out, was simpler than I expected. I did not need the house. I needed the truth that nobody there ever had the right to charge me for dignity. A week later, Dennis texted Eleanor asking if I would at least tell church members the family was trying its best. That finally made me laugh. Trying your best is forgetting a pie in the oven. Trying your best is not selling your daughter's belongings, changing locks, inventing abuse, and then calling the consequences unfair. I never answered him. My apartment stopped feeling like an escape and started feeling like home. I bought a new desk, framed one of my old sketches, and set the recovered watch beside the lamp each night, not as a trophy, but as proof that time really does reveal people. Spring made the whole story easier to see. Trees outside the hospital started budding, and somewhere in the ordinary rhythm of shifts, groceries, bills, and evenings, without emergency family calls, I noticed I no longer flinched every time my phone buzzed. Jessa said I looked different, less happy than less braced. She was right. I was learning what life felt like when I did not have to pre-game every conversation with a defense strategy. One Saturday, she dragged me to a flea market 2 counties over because she said replacing stolen furniture required ceremony. We found a sturdy side table, a lamp with a crooked shade, and a ridiculous ceramic bowl shaped like a swan that she insisted looked like me if I were decorative and judgmental. The whole morning was almost embarrassingly normal, which made it healing. Drama had been the family language I grew up speaking. Peace still felt like a dialect I was learning late. That same week, the attorney confirmed Dennis and Cheryl were fully out. The remaining property issues were straightforward, and the paper version of the story was finally over. I expected triumph. What I felt was clean relief, like taking off shoes that never fit right. Eleanor came over with takeout and the final documents, then handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was my watch, polished. She had taken it to be cleaned without telling me. I laughed and cried at the same time. Then she said the words I needed from her more than I knew. I should have stepped in sooner. I knew more than I admitted, and I thought keeping things calm was kindness. I am sorry. That apology landed because it had no excuse hidden inside it. No if you felt hurt. No but family. Just truth and ownership. A few days later, I ran into Brianna at a pharmacy. She asked if I was still milking the whole thing. I told her there was nothing to milk. There was only a record. She rolled her eyes and said families fight. I told her healthy ones do not turn theft into a group project and then call the victim dramatic. She muttered that I always thought I was better than everyone. For a second, I almost corrected her, then realized I did not need her understanding to validate what happened. So I just said no. I finally think I am equal to everyone, and walked away. That sentence followed me the rest of the day because it named the change more clearly than any self-help phrase ever had. The goal was never superiority. It was equality. The right not to be volunteered, sold, smeared, or emotionally invoiced because I had been trained to endure it quietly. One evening in late May, I sat on my apartment floor assembling the new desk that would replace the one my father sold, and I realized how different rebuilding feels when nobody is standing over you, asking what your healing cost them. Jessa was there with takeout and a screwdriver she absolutely did not know how to use, giving unhelpful advice and making me laugh every time I got too serious. Eleanor stopped by later with lemon bars and looked around my apartment like she was measuring peace instead of square footage. We talked about how easy it is for decent people to mistake patience for love and silence for wisdom. She told me she was proud that I had stopped negotiating with disrespect just because it came from blood. I told her I learned that from watching her choose truth over appearances when it mattered most. That night, with the desk finally built and the watch ticking softly beside the lamp, the place felt less like somewhere I escaped to, and more like a life I actually owned. By summer, the whole situation had settled into the kind of distance that finally lets you hear your own thoughts again. Dennis became someone I occasionally heard about instead of someone whose mood set the temperature of my week. Cheryl still tried to circulate softer versions of the story where stress and misunderstanding somehow did the stealing for them, but fewer people entertained it. Eleanor sold the house to a young couple expecting their first child, and I loved that the rooms would finally belong to people building a future instead of managing a hierarchy. On closing day, we drove past after signing papers. The porch light was off in the afternoon sun. The flower beds were trimmed, and the windows were open. I remembered Eleanor telling me years earlier that a lit porch tells good people they are welcome and bad people they are visible. Truth works the same way. It does not always make you popular, but it makes everyone easier to see. That is why my father ended up begging me to explain only hours after locking me out and selling my things. He was never confused about what happened. He was confused that the old system failed. He thought shame would still steer me. He thought church gossip, Christmas guilt, and blood ties would keep me performing daughterhood on demand. He thought I would scramble to earn my way back into a room they had already emptied. Instead, I took the story to the one woman who owned the house, kept records, and valued truth over appearances. Everything after that was consequence. The notice, the footage, the pawn record, the collapsing gossip, the porch begging. None of it was revenge for the sake of pain. It was reality catching up to people who had been living on borrowed power. If there is a lesson in this, it is not that family should be discarded lightly. It is that family is not a coupon code for access to your dignity. Love without respect becomes control. Silence does not preserve peace. It preserves the pattern that keeps hurting you. I used to think strength meant enduring one more holiday, one more insult, one more demand, disguised as obligation. Now I know strength can look like screenshots, witnesses, paperwork, a lawyer, a best friend with takeout, a grandmother with a blue folder, and a woman who finally stops paying humiliation as rent. My father locked me out and sold my things. Hours later, he was begging me to explain. But by then, I finally understood something he never did. My value was never inside that room. It was in the part of me they could not pawn, smear, or lock outside. Once I stopped begging to be loved correctly, they lost the only tool that had ever really worked on me. That was the real ending, and it was enough.